Welcome, traveler. Welcome to the myth of the fallen one. I am Elnad El-Kazmanai, and today we enter the war that lives inside us all. Not a war between nations or religions, but a war of structures, a silent civil war between mind, emotion, and body, each claiming the throne of identity. From the moment you became aware, you were taught to mistake movement for self, to believe that the voice in your head is you, that the surge in your chest defines you, that the body you inhabit contains you, and because these forces are intimate and loud, you crowned them without question. But what happens when the mind calls itself king, when emotion floods the kingdom, when the body rises and demands obedience? Conflict begins, fragmentation spreads, and the inner life turns into a battlefield where every structure fights for authority and none can bring peace. This is not a call to suppress thought, silence emotion, or escape the body. It is a call to restore order, to question the throne itself, to ask the one question most people avoid. If you can witness the mind speaking, if you can feel emotions rising and falling, if you can observe the body demanding, then who is the one who witnesses? Tonight, we do not begin with comfort, but with the crack in the illusion, because the greatest war you will ever fight is the one that has been calling itself you. Part 1. The War of Structures. From the moment you became aware of yourself, you were taught to mistake structures for identity, and that single mistake became the seed of nearly every inner conflict you have ever called personal, spiritual, moral, or psychological. You were taught that the voice in your head is you, that the surge of emotion in your chest defines you, that the body you inhabit contains you, and because these structures are intimate, unavoidable, and loud, you never stopped to question the assumption. You built your life on it the way a child builds a home from whatever is nearest, not because it is true, but because it is all the child has been given. And then you grew into that house, and the house grew around you, and you forgot there had ever been another possibility. But what you call yourself has never been what you are. It has only been what moves. The mind speaks first and speaks most, and because it speaks like an authority, you bow as if speech were kingship, as if narrative were truth, as if explanation were salvation. The mind does not merely think, it claims the throne by sheer persistence, because it is always on, always interpreting, always stitching a story through your experience until you no longer remember what life feels like without commentary. It takes memory and calls it identity, takes prediction and calls it wisdom, takes fear and calls it caution, takes control and calls it responsibility, and then it demands that you trust it because it can produce words, because it can build reasons, because it can manufacture certainty even when the universe offers none. It speaks when nothing is required. It speaks in the presence of silence, as if silence were a threat. It speaks in the presence of mystery, as if mystery were an insult. And because you were trained to measure yourself by what you can name, you surrendered the center to the structure that names. Yet the simplest fracture in the illusion is already available to you. Because if you can hear the mind, then the mind cannot be the hearer. And if you can witness thought arise, then thought cannot be the witness. Whatever can be observed cannot be the observer. Whatever can be heard cannot be the one who hears. And the moment you stop drowning in thought long enough to notice thought, something in you stands back, not as an achievement, not as a technique, but as a fact that was always true. Thoughts rise and fall, like clouds, crossing the sky, and you have spent most of your life hypnotized by the clouds, believing the weather is the sky, believing the storm is the atmosphere itself, and because of that confusion, you have rarely seen the sun. Not because the sun is absent, but because the moving cover convinces you that movement is reality and stillness is a void. Emotions then deepen the illusion, not because they are inferior to thought, but because they carry the force of immediacy, and immediacy persuades in a way that arguments never can. Fear tightens your chest and turns the present into an emergency. Desire pulls you forward and names itself destiny. Anger burns and calls itself justice. Grief collapses the horizon and calls itself truth. Joy rises and claims eternity in a single wave. Because emotions move through the body, because they vibrate in the nervous system, because they alter breath and posture and appetite and tone, you learn to say, "This is me," as if intensity were identity, as if the loudest signal were the deepest self. But emotions are not kings. They are signals, and a signal is not a sovereign. It is a message passing through a system that has forgotten who receives it. Emotions are measurements of contact with reality, but measurement is not mastery, and the proof is already in the movement. What you call truth today contradicts what you called truth yesterday, and if you were your emotions, you would cease to exist every time the wave subsides. Yet something in you remains while entire emotional worlds rise, crest, and dissolve, and the waves can be real without being the ocean, and the storm can be real without being the depth. The body then seals the confusion through weight, through pleasure and pain, through hunger and fatigue, through illness, craving, sexuality, aging, and decay, through the blunt immediacy of sensation that convinces you the instrument must be the source because the instrument shouts. The body is a laboratory of reality, and it reports through sensation, but sensation is not identity. Sensation is contact. The body demands attention because life requires maintenance, and attention slowly hardens into identification until the structure feels like the self, until pain feels like an ultimate argument, until craving feels like a commandment, until fatigue feels like a verdict against existence itself. And when the body cannot recognize a legitimate center, it attempts to become one, escalating signal into dominance, amplifying pain into control, turning cravings into a throne, not because the body's evil, but because it has learned no master worth obeying. The body does not recognize the mind as king, because the mind is often arid, detached, and tyrannical, demanding obedience without nourishment. The body does not recognize emotion as king, because emotion is volatile, flooding and retreating, promising certainty and then reversing. And so the body tries to rule itself through sensation, because sensation at least is immediate, at least is unquestionable, at least arrives with force. Yet the body is born, shaped, injured, medicated, exhausted, and replaced cell by cell over time. And you did not choose its form, and you will not be asked whether you wish to keep it. And still something in you remains, while the body changes like a landscape passing behind a window. The structure is intimate and sacred as an instrument, but disastrous as a throne. Here's the turning point you must not soften. Mind, emotions, and body are not separate, and their entanglement is precisely why the war is so relentless. The body speaks through emotion. Emotion agitates thought. Thought reshapes the body. And there's no clean border where one ends and the other begins. Only the illusion of lines drawn by the mind that loves separation, because separation makes it feel like ruler. When the body stirs the waters to communicate, and the mind, miscentered, interprets the stirring as threat, it tries to control the waters, and control becomes force, and force becomes resistance, and resistance becomes internal conflict. When emotions surge as signals, and the mind turns signals into stories, the signal is corrupted at the source, and the center receives not truth, but interpretation. And the entire system begins responding to false information. You call that anxiety. You call that depression. You call that shadow. But these are not mysterious curses. They are predictable consequences of a kingdom with no center, where each structure tries to become king because none can bow. You were trained to handle this war by moralizing it, by naming one structure virtuous and another sinful, by praising control as goodness, by praising passivity as love, by praising obedience as holiness. But moral language often hides functional failure. The problem is not that the structures exist. The problem is that the structures have been enthroned. When mind, emotion, and body each compete for authority, life becomes a civil war inside a single being. And in civil war, even good instruments become weapons. The mind will call itself truth and demand that you suppress your body. The emotions will call themselves authenticity and demand that you betray your future. The body will call itself necessity and demand that you sacrifice your integrity, and because you identify with each demand as it rises, you become fragmented, and fragmentation is not merely a psychological inconvenience. It is the engine of suffering because a divided system cannot rest. This is why letting it be is not enough when there is no center. Structures without a throne do not harmonize through tolerance. They escalate through competition. Regulation becomes exhausting, discipline becomes brittle, suppression becomes shadow, indulgence becomes addiction, and the being keeps collapsing inward because the true sovereign has not been named. You can meditate, you can breathe, you can optimize habits, you can decorate the prison beautifully, you can rearrange the furniture until it looks like freedom, and still the foundation remains untouched if the throne remains empty or occupied by a pretender. The ancient texts were not romantic when they spoke of foundations trembling. Illusion does not loosen politely. When the center begins to reassert itself, structures resist because resistance is how a false king survives, and that resistance appears as fear, as tightness, as inner protest, as the feeling that something is being taken from you, when in reality, only false authority is being revoked. So if mind, emotion, and body are structures, and if each becomes tyrant when enthroned, then the question you cannot avoid is not, how do I manage them better, but where is the center they were always meant to serve? Because without that center, every victory is temporary, and every peace is a pause before the next uprising. And this is where part 1 ends, not with comfort, but with the crack itself. If you can witness the mind speaking, the emotions surging, and the body demanding, then the witness is not any of these things. And yet even the witness can become another throne if it begins to interpret, to control, to build a new empire out of observation itself. The war does not end when you create a more refined tyrant. The war ends when everything bows to what was never in motion. Part 2: The Center, the Sun, and the Order of Life. Now the question sharpens because it is not enough to deny false identity. You must understand what makes coherence possible, or you will simply trade one king for another and call it awakening. The center is not another structure competing for dominance, and it is not a moral posture, and it is not a personality that argues with the mind and words. The center is the silent gravity that causes the entire system to align without negotiation once it is recognized. This is why the deepest traditions do not treat the center as something you manufacture, but as something you remember, because it was never absent, only ignored, and what you ignore will be replaced by whatever shouts loudest. Look at the world, because the world is not separate from you. It is the same pattern expressed at scale. The land beneath your feet is the body, dense, bearing weight, carrying form, receiving impact, aging through erosion, holding scars, and still remaining earth. The waters are emotion, fluid, responsive, rising and falling under invisible forces, crashing, retreating, nourishing, drowning, cleansing, corroding, reflecting. The sky is mind, vast, restless, filled with movement, clouding and clearing, changing shapes without permission, narrating the day and weather. And if you try to separate them cleanly, you will fail, because there is no place where the ocean ends and the sky begins. The ocean becomes vapor, vapor becomes cloud, cloud becomes rain, rain becomes river, river becomes ocean again, and the wind that rides the sky carves waves into the sea, and those waves crash against land like emotion crashes against the body. These structures are woven like threads in a single carpet, not stacked like bricks with neat labels, and that entanglement is precisely why misalignment becomes chaos, because when one rises without coherence, the others are dragged into the turbulence. But the earth does not disintegrate into random debris, and the ocean does not evaporate into a permanent void, and the sky does not turn into endless storm without rhythm, because there is a center that all of them obey. And that center is not a committee and not a negotiation. That center is the sun. The sun burns, and because it burns, gravity forms, and because gravity forms, the earth is held inward rather than flying apart, And because the earth is held inward, the waters can cycle without being lost. And because the waters can cycle, life can exist in rhythm rather than in chaos. The sun does not convince the planet to orbit. It does not argue. It does not plead. It does not moralize. It simply is what it is, and everything that remains near it becomes ordered by its presence. If the earth refused the sun, it would disintegrate. If the waters ignored it, they would scatter into madness. If the sky denied it, climate would collapse, and the cycle would break. The world is held together because structures bow to center, and when structures do not bow, they do not become bad, they become catastrophic, not through moral failure, but through functional misfire. This is the shape of your inner life as well. Mind, emotions, and body do not require destruction. They require orbit. They require the gravitational center that makes them coherent, because coherence is what ends war, and war is what drains life. When the center is recognized, the mind does not need to speak constantly to feel safe. It can speak when called and remain silent when silence is the correct tool. Emotions do not need to flood to seize attention. They can rise as signals and fall as waves without claiming kingship. The body does not need to escalate sensation into tyranny. It can communicate needs without becoming a dictator. And you do not let them be in the naive sense of tolerating the civil war. You bring them into alignment the way gravity brings orbit, not through violence, but through rightful hierarchy. Now the observer must be placed precisely, because you are right. The observer is the best structure the mind can offer the center when it is humble, but it becomes another trap when it starts interpreting. Observation, when pure, is a clean transmission. It is the instrument panel that reports without editorializing, and the moment it editorializes, it corrupts the signal, because the observer is limited by education, fear, history, and brain capacity, and interpretation is often the mind trying to reclaim kingship under the mask of wisdom. A true observer says, "This is happening," and stops there, because the center does not need commentary to receive truth. It needs clean contact. Analysis is a tool for the miscentered, and it is sometimes necessary while you are still trapped in the war, because when you are fragmented, you must reflect to see where the fragments pull. But once the center is restored, analysis becomes noise, like a servant who keeps shouting instructions while the king is already moving, like a counselor who cannot stop speaking even when the throne has decided. The center receives, the center responds, and the structures obey. And this obedience is not slavery, it is relief, because a structure forced to rule beyond its design becomes exhausted and resentful, but a structure allowed to serve becomes precise, powerful, and clean. This is why Jesus, read without softening, is not a moral mascot and not a symbol of politeness, but an image of hierarchy restored. "I and the Father are one" is not a slogan, it is alignment. "And I only do what my Father shows me" is not passivity, it is correct order, the mind and body and emotion obeying the center rather than competing to be it. From that order comes the strange mixture that confuses sentimental religion: gentleness and severity, mercy and disruption, healing and confrontation, forgiveness and refusal. People call this contradiction because they moralize functions, but in reality, it is precision, love applied where it heals, disruption applied where it prevents corruption, silence applied where speech would feed distortion, war applied where a misfiring power threatens the whole. A function is not a virtue or vice by itself. It becomes right or wrong based on alignment with the center and the effect on coherence. To be good toward what destroys is not goodness, it is enabling, and enabling is misfiring. To be kind to the tyrant while the victim bleeds is not love, it is abdication. And when you feel guilt after disruption, that guilt is often the residue of moral conditioning, not the signal of wrongdoing, because you were trained to associate love with softness and truth with comfort, as if illusion can be dismantled gently. Now you wanted the question at the end, and it must land like an open door rather than a slogan. So here it is, placed in the exact spot where the listener must face it. If the mind speaks, and emotions surge, and the body demands, and you can witness all of it, then what are you? If you are not the land, not the waters, not the sky, then what is the sun in you? What is the gravity that holds the orbit? What is the center that does not argue yet orders everything by its presence? And here the house metaphor returns, because it never fails when it is kept clean. Walls can be named, measured, separated, west wall, east wall, roof, foundation. Yet remove their connection, and none of them can stand, and the structure collapses inward because it has lost the coherence that makes it a house rather than debris. What makes the house is not the walls, it is the space they hold, the designated space that becomes a place of living because consciousness gives it role. The space inside does not age, the space outside does not age, and the difference between them is not essence but designation, not substance but function, and we call that designation life, we call it experience, we call it existence. But reducing yourself only to the inside space, only to the role, only to the designated room of experience, creates forgetfulness, because you begin to believe the room is all that exists. You begin to believe the walls are reality, and you begin to crown the structures that manage the room as if they were the source of space itself. That is the root of the ancient warning. Forgetfulness is not ignorance of information, it is ignorance of center. It is the loss of the sun, the loss of gravity, the loss of orbit, and when the center is forgotten, the structures do what structures do in the absence of hierarchy. They compete, they seize, they dominate, they fragment, and they call their conflict me. So the work is not to destroy the mind, suppress emotions, or hate the body, and it is not to indulge them either. The work is to restore the center they were meant to serve, until mind becomes a clear instrument rather than a tyrant, until emotion becomes a clean signal rather than a flood, until the body becomes a faithful laboratory rather than a dictator. When that happens, the war ends not because you won, but because no one is pretending to be king anymore, and the entire system finally discovers what it feels like to be held, to orbit, to belong. And if you want the final line to remain a question rather than an answer, then let it be the only honest seal. If everything in you can be observed, what remains when everything bows? And now you have seen the battlefield. You have seen how the mind claims authority through narrative, how emotion claims authority through intensity, how the body claims authority through force, and how each structure, when enthroned, becomes a tyrant in the absence of a true center. The war is not mystical, and it is not accidental. It is the predictable result of confusion. But confusion only survives while it remains unseen. The moment you recognize that what speaks is not the speaker, that what surges is not the source, that what demands is not the sovereign, something begins to loosen. Not collapse, loosen. The throne trembles not because something new has been built, but because something false has been recognized. And recognition is the beginning of order. So do not rush to replace one king with another. Do not crown the observer. Do not build a new identity out of awareness itself. Let the question remain open. Let the silence remain unclaimed. Let the center reveal itself without force. Because the war does not end when you fight better. It ends when everything remembers what it was meant to serve.